Good evening. My name is Emily Dares. I am a first-year data science for public policy graduate student in the McCourt School of Public Policy, as well as a graduate assistant in the Tech and Public Policy program. I'm a proud child of two successful technologists who immigrated to the US during the excitement of the American tech boom. This inspired my acute awareness of the role technology plays in our society at large. After developing a passion for tech policy, I had the privilege of coming to DC to learn from some of the most influential individuals driving the technology regulation initiative, such as Senator Mark Warner. The mission of technological equity, safety, and privacy in conjunction with innovation has never been more urgent, which is why it is my pleasure to introduce Senator Mark Warner today. Senator Warner was elected to the United States Senate from Virginia in 2008. He serves as chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence and as a member of the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committees. Prior to his career in the Senate, he served as the governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. During his time in the Senate, Senator Warner established himself as a bipartisan leader who works across the aisle to accomplish real solutions for Virginians. He spent 20 years as a successful technology and business leader in Virginia before entering public office. Senator Warner has been a leading voice in the Senate calling for increased efforts into appropriately regulating and addressing the threats of AI while still harnessing its full potential. He engaged directly with AI companies to push for responsible development and deployment. Following his remarks, the senator will take your questions in a discussion moderated by Mo Alithi, Executive Director of GU Politics. You can join the conversation on social media by tagging @GU Politics and the official event hashtag Warner at GU. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mo Alithi and Senator Mark Warner.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Great crowd. I also want to thank Michelle and the Tech and Public Policy Initiative for co-sponsoring this with us. Senator, welcome back.
Thank you.
So,
great to be back.
Full disclosure, the senator and I have known each other for nearly a quarter of a century.
You were much younger then.
And you were much better looking. We worked together. I worked for him when he was the Democratic nominee for governor of Virginia. And we traveled all over Virginia together, and it's been interesting and fun to watch your career as you moved to the Senate and really emerged as a leading voice on national security issues and a leading voice on tech issues. So thrilled to have you back. We today are going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and democracy. Good. And where I really want to focus at is election security and national security, and see where else the students take us, because their questions are always better than mine. But Senator, we found an audio clip that we wanted to set the table with, because I think it does a good job of setting the table for this conversation. So can we hit play on the audio?
Maybe where we ought to start is where the most immediate harm can come. Most people realize that AI can have a massive impact on the baby boomer generation and how they access social media. I think most people also realize AI tools can have a massive disruption to our data privacy. Maybe we can start with those two as a starting point. Just so you know, this isn't actually me. This recording was generated using artificial intelligence.
So there we have it.
Was that my voice?
It's scary, right?
It's scary. Well, it's, you can make the judge whether it's sounded.
That one was easier to listen to sometimes as a former staffer of yours.
A gentle, kind.
That's right, yeah. I'm used to you yelling at me. So let's start with this. Let's start with what are the greatest risks that generative AI pose to election security, national security, wherever you want to take it?
Well, first of all, Mel, thank you for having me. It's great to be back on Georgetown campus. I have to, in full disclosure, acknowledge as a kid who had grown up around the country, Midwest and Connecticut, I was very anxious to come to college in DC and applied to AU, GW, and Georgetown. I was lucky enough to get into all three. GW gave me a little more money, so I ended up going there. And it's, I've had an interesting journey, and I've really enjoyed the time that Mo and I worked together and what I learned from Mo. Let me also say on AI, I can't think of a topic that I've spent more time on. And normally, at least in the last couple of years, and normally you spend more time on a topic and there's some linear relationship that you actually think you're getting smarter on the topic. Not so much with AI. I've got probably as many questions as I started with. And I also think I can't think of something where some of the fundamental premises have changed as much. If we go way back in time to a year ago, and I was first getting to know Sam Altman and Alex Wang and some of the guys and gals from NVIDIA, the basic economic premise there was the enterprises that would win would be who has the most data, who has the most compute, who has the most ability to test that data, and you got to have a lot of money. So from a national security standpoint, I was very concerned about China. And when I say China, let me make clear my beef is with the Communist Party of China and Xi's leadership, and it's not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora, because China had a lot of those. And I thought from a domestic standpoint, OpenAI with its partnership with Microsoft and Anthropic with its partnership with Google and now Amazon, that they would probably win. And that was the premise that our government started with in terms of the large language models. Then if you fast forward to March, April, a lot of those economic premises kind of got turned on its head when Meta released Llama into the world, and suddenly we're seeing UAE create a large language model for pennies on the dollar. And a lot of the presumptions that all of the AI apps would be bolted onto a large language model, I think have all been thrown kind of asunder. And I thought for a while, like the intelligence community, if we combined all of the pixels from overhead and all the intercepts from SIGINT and the human intelligence, that we might have a single, large language model for the intel community. I'm not sure that's the case, and I think there is a lot of jump ball here. So this is something that, from my mind, is a work in progress, number one. Number two, I've almost also seen, I've hosted about 6 or 7 forums where I bring in a couple of AI experts, always bipartisan, and have a real discussion. Some of the larger forums that have taken place where you've got 14 talking heads, there's some value there, but you don't have the interaction. So to get to your question, the two areas where, and we'll focus on risk at the front end, what are the two domains where AI today, not with the next iteration or the next generation, what are the two domains that I think could have the most immediate risk in terms of, and particularly risk in terms of a large-scale massive change or massive undermining? One is faith in our public elections, and lots of talk about that, and deep fakes and other tools, disinformation, misinformation. The other is faith in our public markets. And where there's been a lot less focus, but I could go through in more detail than you'd want about how you could manipulate public stocks, how you could create a series of not just deep fakes, but fake consumer complaints, fake SEC filings that could really mess with the public markets. And one of the reasons I've been thinking about this is that Congress has been pathetically ineffective at putting any guardrails on social media. In 2017, I put out a white paper with 23 ideas. I've got 9 bipartisan pieces of legislation, and we've done squat. Meta finally changed and is reporting some of their political ads, but there's still no prohibition that if you want to buy a political ad with rubles, you don't even have to disclose that if you use social media, whereas you would if it's TV or radio. So I have some humility about Congress's poor track record on getting things done, and I do think, though, that from a sausage-making standpoint of how you build legislation, the idea of combining, capitalists who are concerned about markets with small d Democrats who are concerned about elections might be a space where we could see some overlap, and I've got some specific ideas. So I do think the public markets and public elections are probably the areas that scare me the most. On the upside, I would say somebody, and this was from a guy named Jason Kelly, who's in the synthetic bio world from Boston. He had a really cool comment, I thought, which is, when you think about large language models, you're putting together language models and competing against humans that have used language for, pick your number, thousands and thousands of years. And consequently, to get something that can compete with a human is a real tough notion. He's in the synthetic biospace. There is languages, and I'm learning this very much, about DNA mapping and how DNA interacts with itself. If you could create the equivalent of a large language model using all of the DNA data, you might see transformations take place. Now, you could also see, hallucinations and bad outcomes, and you need human beings in that. So I would put fear side, markets, elections in terms of immediate. I would put upside in terms of life sciences. And then there are just the overarching needs about bias in our data and the notion of having consumers, people realize what is doctored information you're receiving, and how do we get to some standard on things like watermarking and so forth.
So I want to pull on the thread that you just started a few moments ago. Last time you were here, I actually think we were in the same room. It was right ahead of the 2018 midterms.
Wasn't nearly a smarter group.
That's it, exactly. It was ahead of the 2018 midterms, and we were talking about foreign interference in elections. That was the topic back then. And even then, you were beating your head against the table over the fact that there was no effective regulation, that we kind of let social media take off. Are we getting ahead of the curve this time? The president came out, I guess, this last week with an executive order. The international community just gathered in the UK, right, a couple of days ago. The vice president represented us there. Have we learned any lessons from social media?
I don't think so. I mean, if anything, we focused on 2018. We were here about election interference. We've seen in social media, I think huge effects on all people, particularly young people's mental health. We've had all kinds of negative outcomes, and there's good from social media. I don't question that premise at all. But the fact that we've not even put things like a privacy law in place, or data portability, or interoperability, or the ability to have market-based solutions, that if you get tired of a platform, you can move easily elsewhere. I was a telecom guy, and back in the old days, it used to be really hard to move from one telco to another. You had to port your number. The ease of being able to have the market mechanisms create some more competition. We've failed miserably beyond any of the kind of next iteration. And if you look around the world, the EU is further along. Frankly, China has actually, for domestic consumption, part of this is because the CCP doesn't want the Chinese population asking a large language model about what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. But they are further along. UK is kind of, not as much. But the normal reaction I hear from from some of the folks in the tech community of, oh gosh, you put some regs in place, it's going to slow innovation, the world's going to end. I think that is not a credible argument. And I also feel like, if we don't act, others will. And one of the things that AI brings in an exponentially greater way than what's already happened on social media is speed and scale, which, if anybody's interfaced with ChatGPT or any large language models, you see how quickly it reacts. And the ability, at least from the Russians in 2016, for a while, they used bots and they had to actually use real people to create these fake images of Americans. As you heard, from the audio you just played, you can do that now without the need for the group coming out of St. Petersburg in 2016. You could do that, and frankly, I'm surprised we're not seeing more of that. Things like market manipulation, less so in elections, but market manipulation is already illegal in certain ways. But the speed and the scale with which bad guys or bad gals can do this now is really what makes AI such a potentially negative, powerful tool.
So what infrastructure do we need to put in place to deal. Let's start specifically with the election issues.
Elections are much harder. So we're working on some legislation that would at least say, should you have some indication on political advertising if it's been altered by AI? And Google's already said they're going to do watermarking, but unless you have a common standard, and I think it needs to be regulated, you can end up with 27 different watermarks that consumers would never understand, number one. Number two, I do think there ought to be, beyond the kind of disclosure rules, I think there ought to be some ability to have outside experts, academics, frankly, look at some of the security measures that are kind of built in. Now, the president's EO tries to get at this, but unless you put some teeth behind it, it's still mostly collaborative rather than mandatory. And I think some of this stuff you need mandatory. And I have a lot of suspicion when Schumer had the kind of who's who from civil society and social media, and everybody raises their hand when they say we need regulation. Easy to raise your hand, harder when you actually have to put words on a page to see if you can actually get things done. And I also think there may be a concept that we're borrowing from kind of the financial sector, because this can happen, this manipulation can happen at such a scale and speed. We may need to port over things from like financial services that if you use AI in this malicious way and you hit a threshold of things that are already illegal, we might want to use things like treble damages that kind of in effect say, okay, you do this, this is such an important tool, we're going to put a bigger damage on the back end. I mean, that concept is used already in the financial sector, but admittedly it'll be easier to do this in the financial sector. But I do think if we can align the interest, because I have great respect for the power of big tech and their ability to kind of say you're going to squash innovation or you're going to over-regulate. That's why I think you got to have the alignment with the financial markets and other financial interests to kind of have big C capitalists work with small d Democrats, of good people of goodwill in both parties, to get something done. Because I don't believe a elections only regulation on AI will actually ever become law, at least in the short term before next presidential election.
The president met with all the heads of the tech companies as he was beginning this process. You sent a letter to all the tech companies that was sort of a, come on guys, get your, thanks for coming, but let's get our acts together here. My interpretation of what you said to them. Do you think they get it?
Yeah, I think they get it. Do I think they'll do something on their own? No, I mean, again, if we go back to the social media as a precursor, one of the things that we really need, we need academic and independent experts to help validate some of these activities. We've seen, again, I don't want to come back just to Meta/Facebook. They will do some of this voluntary participation, but when push comes to shove and you're actually starting to impede on their ability to make money, it gets undermined. But I do think having this, especially with all the problems around bias and all the problems around what data sets you're using and what kind of security is being built in, having that kind of independent checking entity is really important. When we started this, there were a lot of my Republican colleagues, when they first kind of got blown away and say, oh my gosh, how are we going to figure this out? There was a lot, well, we ought to create a new agency that has AI expertise. I mean, in today's political situation, in particular with the House, I'm not sure the House Republicans are going to, create a new agency. So even though we can't create a new agency, and there's, valid arguments on both ends of whether you do it by subject matter or whether you do it in a single entity, we are going to need the equivalent of a Manhattan project-style group of experts to help the public sector writ large figure this out. And I do think, whether we're talking about people at Georgetown or elsewhere, the mission is so important that I think people will step up to that. and whether we do it like the digital services that Obama created or 21F or some of these other projects. I'm not sure what the format ought to be and where you ought to put it. But we're going to need the best and the brightest to help us out on this.
One of the things I thought was super interesting coming out of the Global Summit in London this week was it felt like so much of the conversation revolved around the existential threat, right? Is AI going to kill us all, kill off humanity? And that seems to be, a lot of the conversation that I hear, at least in the public, square, revolves around that. And there does not seem to be a whole hell of a lot of, it is a controversial position to take. I thought it was interesting that the vice president, when she was there, was like, well, you all are talking about this doomsday scenario. Let's talk about some of these immediate challenges, like bias, like, some of the things that you talked about. And I guess, as a political guy, it makes me wonder, and you might have touched on this a little bit, but how do we get our policymakers to actually have the right conversation around this?
I do think the kind of, any of you all old enough to remember the movie 2001? I'm not going to look at the people who are old enough here to I think that HAL existential threat is probably an overstatement at this point. And a little bit of a red herring, and it's kind of used by some folks to say, everybody's overstating. But I'll give you, two examples. A lot of stuff that happens in our legal system is based upon, if somebody's doing something bad, you're based upon intent. There was I think it was a Michigan professor who did this, used the AI tool to basically say to an AI tool, go make money, which is a fine intent. But the AI tool then created a series of fake accounts that did wash sales that had an amazing ability to manipulate a stock price. So there is no boundary on how the AI tool gets to the goal. And I think that raises a whole question. So much of our existing legal structure says you got to prove the bad guy had a bad intent. I think that's one of the kind of biggest mind-twisting things here. There could be really bad actions out of some of these tools without malicious intent.
I want to pivot a little bit to national security. As we look at all the conflicts happening around the world, I remember last time you were here, you were very passionate in talking about how the United States defense ecosystem hadn't caught up to the changing theater of war, right? That we had moved more to cyber, from sort of kinetic warfare. And AI is going to take that to sort of a whole new level. How should we be thinking about that, the role of AI when it comes to national defense? And
AI, I think, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, one of the things, if I have a single mission, and I know we're going to get to I'm sure we'll get to the conflict in Ukraine and obviously the horror that's taking place in the Middle East at this point. But I think national security is no longer tanks and guns and ships and planes. It is who wins the race around AI. It is, for somebody who used to be in the wireless industry, it is the fact that when China suddenly created in Huawei the definitive 5G provider that was suddenly smoking everybody else in the world and had backdoors that had an enormous security risk. It is who wins the battle around satellites. It is synthetic biology. Are we going to build the capacity as we move from kind of traditional biotech to biomanufacturing? All these technology domains, and I think we have to put some points on the board. We have, along with others around the world, pointed out the problem around Huawei, and literally nation states are moving away from that. I would argue the CHIPS bill, which I did with John Cornyn, was about bringing back that technology capacity, innovation capacity. It's why I'm a huge advocate as we think about a different energy economy and all for traditional green energy. But I think we got to re-examine nuclear energy, and small modular nukes, I think, offer an enormous possibility. And China and Russia are literally signing up nation states for 50 years to contracts, and that is part of national security. So AI is a component part of the the battle between authoritarian regimes and non-authoritarian regimes about who's going to win the technology battles.
It's interesting, when Michelle and I were talking in preparation for this, she brought up something that hadn't even occurred to me, and that is, sort of the whole question around some of the ethical issues around the use of AI in warfare. Drones, for example, targeting humans without human oversight, right? I mean, that creeps me out a bit.
It should.
How should we, and then these future policymakers,
that's again the
be
kind of
thinking about
evolution
this?
of, well, if the adversary does it without human interface, that means default to, that non-authoritarian regime should. And I don't think we figured that out. We have to some level around, and not perfectly. We say people can kill each other in war. We say there are some rules around chemical use or nuclear use. And obviously that has not been adhered to, particularly in terms of use of chemical weapons, completely. And why we have to interface with, some rules of the game here. I mean, if you look at the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I mean, drones have fundamentally changed that. The amount of really expensive equipment that we and Europeans sent to Ukraine, and vice versa, Russian equipment that's been taken out by cheapy drones, and most of those still have to be driven by human. But I won't cite his name, but there is a leading, everybody in this room would know, major American technologist, not Elon Musk, but who is trying to say, if we can bring software to drones and swarm them without the need for any individual person to direct drone by drone, he believes that Ukraine could actually penetrate and overwhelm Russia's defenses. Now, as somebody who thinks Putin is the aggressor and that he cannot be and should not be successful, and I think Ronald Reagan's got to be flipping in his grave, as some of my Republican friends are willing to kind of sell out Ukraine. But the price of saying, well, gosh, we want Ukraine to win, but are we going to suddenly take the human out of the equation on how a relatively simple tool like a drone is used? This is why, again, we need your help, not just on the technology piece, but we need your help on the ethical issues around this. These are big time issues.
We're going to move to audience questions in just a couple of moments. You mentioned China earlier. Mm-hmm. They seem at least often to be ahead of us, ahead of the curve on dealing with some of these tech issues. How are they looking at AI? Are there any things that they're doing that we should be freaked out about? Or are there things that we should kind of learn from them?
Well, China has one of the advantages China has, and I think not just America or not just Europe, but frankly Japan, South Korea, and others, China has a very sophisticated effort to steal $500 billion a year of intellectual property. And that helps a lot if you don't have to do that basic R&D, number one. Number two, a lot of my initial ideas around AI were set by somebody born in Taiwan, grew up here in the country, but is back in China, Kai-Fu Lee, who was like the argument that China will have more data and assembles more data, and you've got China, I think, has created almost an Orwellian surveillance state with all this data. And I think that could play to really negative consequences. I do think at times that Xi Jinping made a mistake that will haunt China for a while, when 2014, 2016, 2017 timeframe, and we saw this with Alibaba and others, basically made the decision that to try to keep the Communist Party in power, he would slow or stymie some of the innovation that's taking place in China. So I think we should not make China into the 10-foot tall. They got problems. I mean, it's never a good sign when a country stops supporting like youth unemployment, which they've done, or they've got an overheated real estate market that makes ours look pale in comparison. And I do think the innovation and the kind of sense of human freedom that we have in this country. I'm a big supporter of India and have been trying to push India to get off the fence on the. This was a while back on the moral issues around Putin and Ukraine. And the former senior official said, "Well, that's true. We got some issues, but he didn't know a single Indian that wanted to immigrate to China or Russia." So I think we still have advantages, but I think we have to be wary. In the Soviets, we faced an ideological threat of Russia, ideological threat, and military threat. China, we have never had a peer competitor around technology and around economy, and I think we have to respect that and appreciate that. But I still would take our hand.
Okay, let's get to the good questions now. Raise your hand. Someone from the staff will come around with the microphone. When they come to you, tell us who you are, school year, where you're from, and then ask your question, preferably in the form of a question.
Oh, okay.
Can you stand up so we can?
Hi, so my name is Isabel. I'm a first year in Georgetown's College of Arts and Sciences, which is an undergraduate college, and I'm studying computer science, ethics, and society, which is a new major that's sort of about combining computer science with more like ethical considerations. I'm originally from Taipei, Taiwan, which is why this issue is also very important to me. I guess my question now is, I feel like a lot of the regulation on AI, there's still a lot of like fundamental stuff that we have not regulated, in the sense that if we talk about like large language models or like AI image generators, a lot of these artists and writers that these models have trained on were used without their consent. Like these millions of data that we are talking about in this data set that these AI models are trained on are basically from human works that a lot of them did not consent for. So I guess, like, in your opinion, what are some reparations that can be made so that these human writers and artists can be compensated, or just like, what can we do? Because I feel like that's such a fundamental issue. Like, before we talk about everything else, the data on which these models are trained on is not.
I think, a great and a fair question. And I would almost argue, I'm not sure you said we've not done enough on AI regulation. I don't think we've done anything, number one. Number two, and I am not as current as probably you are on this, I did feel like there's been some, at least informal understanding around artist visual representation. And, when there was the fake song that was it Usher? They were trying to manipulate. It feels like acknowledgement around artistic content. Again, no regulation, but there's some beginnings of acknowledgement that taking that is inappropriate. It gets a lot harder. I met with a person the other day who was, a couple of months ago, he was in the publishing on food magazines. And as Mo knows, I like both food and wine. And he goes like, why would I put another $1 into this? Because if I can ask ChatGPT, make me the best meatloaf, and you don't know whether that came from, Betty Crocker, Julia Child, or last month's gourmet. How do you know around the data that's already all been scraped? And I don't know the answer to that. I do think, interesting enough, like Japan is trying to approach this with as much original content that comes out of Japan. Japan's not trying to put a front-end prohibition on that, which I find a little weird with again, graphic artists and others. So I get the problem. I'm going to need smart people like you to help figure it out. I almost feel like on voice and visual art, I actually think it'll be easier to get there than on copyright and everything. But it's wide open. And so far, at least, and I've had lots of people try to educate me, I've not had anybody say, and here's the answer on that one.
I'm just super impressed you made an Usher reference. Let's go to this side of the room. Just someone on this side of the room.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Aiden. I'm in the School of Foreign Service. I'm a sophomore, and I'm from Northern Virginia, not that far from here. My mom's a public school teacher in Fairfax County. So first of all, I just want to thank you for being here, because for a long time she's kept a picture of when you visited her elementary school, when you were governor of Virginia in the early 2000s.
And how old were you at that point? Were you even born?
No, I wasn't born. That's been yeah. So it must have been.
This is my job.
Welcome to my world now.
Yeah. So.
All right, Aiden.
So on that point, I just wanted to ask kind of a broader question on tech and public policy, because as someone who's interested in public policy and politics, something that was always interesting to me about that time when you were governor and leading up to that is when in your 2001 campaign there was a song, a bluegrass song, that was a big part of sort of your appeal to rural Americans in western parts of the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'm just wondering, it feels like a lot of that part of America feels like that this growing world of artificial intelligence, automation, and technology is kind of leaving them behind in the job world, especially in those blue-collar jobs, so starting to erode to automation. And now it's even stretching into where I'm from in suburban Northern Virginia, where a lot of white-collar jobs feel threatened by artificial intelligence. And as a result, especially in those rural areas, you're seeing even more economic disenfranchisement, and that can kind of breed reactionary politics. So I'm wondering, if you have any thoughts on this issue.
I got a lot of thoughts. But first of all, well, thanks for referencing, the song. It was, one of the reasons why I did this, I'm first in my family to graduate from college. I failed a couple times, after law school before I was lucky enough to get into the tech stuff. So I've, and I recognize if I had not been a white guy with the appropriate education, I might not have gotten 3 shots or 2 shots or even 1 shot. And I desperately believe probably the single biggest motivator for me to do public service was in this new interconnected world, place shouldn't necessarily matter. Place and distance shouldn't. That was the promise. You go way, way back to like 1996, and there was comparisons who's more important, Bill Gates or Bill Clinton. And we've shown in an interconnected world that it's, we can move the job to Mumbai and Shanghai and elsewhere. We did a crappy job. We still do a crappy job of showing you can move it to Martinsville, Virginia, or Bristol, Virginia, or elsewhere. And cracking the code, and I've tried, regional venture capital funds and access to capital. And, matter of fact, even with Trump, we got $12 billion into community development financial institutions that are real, both rural and underserved Black and brown communities. But until you can make that ability that you should have the opportunity to stay in the community you grew up in, we're not going to ever fully crack this code, number one. And number two, and I think there was kind of this knowing, well, that's just the price of progress when we talk about automation and traditional manufacturing. When it suddenly says, well, maybe that's going to hit the accountants and the lawyers, folks in Northern Virginia elsewhere say, holy crap. So I got 2 ideas that I've tried 2 or 3 years to work on between like the 15 and 2017 idea. I think are still good ideas, but I had miserable success with it that I think would start to address this problem regardless of location. One is, if we ought to create a portable benefit system, so no matter what kind of work you do, no matter what worker classification is, because nobody's going to work for the same job for 45 years the way my dad did. So we ought to have something that says if you're a gig worker, a part-time worker, whatever, with work comes benefits, and those benefits ought to accrue. And if you got 3 different jobs at once, you ought to be able to accrue those. And frankly, the next iteration of labor organizations might manage that. Whoever managed it, we could have jump ball. But we got to create a new social safety net that moves away from the old model that you only get benefits if you work for the same place for a long time. 1. 2, and this is I think is the biggest idea that everybody nods, and with AI now, it'll get another look, which is that if you ask anybody in business, rural or elsewhere, what's your most important asset? Well, they say, oh, it's my people. Yet we have nothing in our tax, accounting, or reporting system that incents any business to invest in human capital. So if you look back in 1970, or like actually late 70s, early 80s, there was a radical idea that really changed America and changed the world that said, we ought to give an incentive to businesses to invest in research and development. And at first the accountants said, R&D, that's too squishy. That's not tangible good. That's not a piece of machinery. But we figured out a tax credit called the R&D tax credit that drove a lot of the innovation from the private sector. I think it's time to create the equivalent of an R&D tax credit for human capital investment. And I would skew that more towards, communities that have not been historically treated well, or rural areas. So the quickie example is, right now, if a company spends $5,000 on a computer, you get an R&D tax credit for that. It's an asset. You can put it on your balance sheet and brag about it. If the same company spends $5,000 taking 2 people in Lynchburg, or let's even get further rural, and trains them to be more efficient than the computer, you get to write that as a business expense, but you don't get a tax credit. It's viewed as a liability, and there's no accounting system to recognize that. So I think the time, especially with the threat of AI coming, to really put policy heft behind investing in human beings and skewing that to people who may have not had the same opportunities I had, would be a way that could not only perhaps give hope in rural, but also give hope for communities that have not had a fair shake.
Thanks for the question. Wow. Let's go to this side of the room.
I have to give shorter answers.
Hi, I'm Zoe Broderick. I'm a sophomore in the college, double majoring in government and Spanish. And my question is, what do you feel is the role of AI in our military, specifically with DARPA's development of AI enhancements for soldiers and the bioethics behind applying AI to humans?
Let's go back to regional stuff in South. No, wow. The kind of idea of, if you add AI combined with synthetic biology, and does that lead to the super soldier? And some nation states are experimenting with that. My immediate reaction is there has to be some rules of engagement. But as we see with conflict around the world, we're not very good at that. And I think what Mo said of trying to make sure that we keep a human in the link is really important. I also think the ethics of whether it's chips in humans and other bioengineering, I'm very worried, scared about that. Again, I don't know how you entirely stop it, though. We could pass a law, but what I worry about in a world where other nation states don't agree to the same set of rules, that at some point the DoD could say, gosh, country X is doing this, we got to counter it. And that would be the negative side. The positive side is, these same arguments, moral and ethical, were raised around nuclear weapons, and we're 70 years in, and we have not pulled the trigger on those. But I think it's you ask a hugely challenging and problematic, and I don't have a soundbite answer.
Okay, this side.
Hey. Hi, my name's Travis Thornton. I'm a Navy veteran, and I had a question about social media. And I know you're kind of bound on free speech with social media, trying to develop solutions for social media. I'm a Master's of Policy Management student, first year, and I actually read and referenced your Safe Tech Act for something I wrote over the summer. I had a question about the algorithms that are being used to promote and demote speech online. At a certain point, it seems like that is a form of speech in itself. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think what Travis is referencing, one of the things that was created before there were social media platforms, when there were just message boards, in 1996, and we did a telecom technology bill, and there was something called Section 230 that basically said, that probably made sense in 1996. If you're on one of these platforms, you have no obligation or responsibility for what appears on your platform. But that has become, I think, crazy. And I could go chapter and verse for the next 20 minutes of examples where harmful content was not dealt with, beyond even kind of on the political opinion side, just where people's lives. I think about, you may remember, Mo, Andy Parker, his daughter was a TV reporter, and with a camera, she was brutally murdered on television. He has been trying to make sure YouTube doesn't repost this video for 8 years. YouTube says, hey, and YouTube, Google, we got no obligation, we're trying to take it down. Baloney. In Section 230 is your get out of jail free card. The Safe Tech Act I had, which was saying if it's illegal in the real world, in the tangible world, that Section 230 should not be a preclusion from at least bringing the case against a platform. You'd still have to prove it. But right now, this throws out entities before they even get a chance to make the case. And one of the things I'm trying to bring over is make sure things like civil rights protections are part of the law that has to be honored in the social media world or in the AI world the way other laws are. But we have been pathetically bad on that. I do think in the how you solve the conundrum of fact-based battles is, I wish I was more optimistic. I wish I had a solution set that didn't sound like, well, you're just buying one set of facts over another. I mean, there are facts. I believe in science. And some of the notion of at least watermarking stuff so you can know it's manipulated or not, regardless of who the manipulator is, would be at least a step in the right direction. But these are the kind of issues that will play out. And again, with AI, it can be done with such scale and such speed now that you could completely convince the country or the world. And by the time you got the facts out, you're chasing the argument's moved on. I don't like my answer. I do think a Section 230 reform would make sense. I do think privacy would make sense. I got no problems with people using our data. I think we ought to know how much it's worth. I had a bill that says, you can use our data, but you ought to put a price on it. But we have been ineffective so far, and if we then think about the next iteration of this with AI, it could be exponentially worse.
All right, let's go to this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Nick, and I'm a first-year student in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm from Massachusetts. My question sort of pertains to the theme of AI decentralization. So in the past, there's been a lot of focus on big companies that are easier to regulate and monitored by the government. And that was true with emerging technologies in the past, like nuclear weaponry, where it was just a few labs heavily monitored by the government. But today with AI especially, it's so decentralized that any individual actor could begin to learn how to use it and potentially build malicious models. So the first part of my question is, do you think we've kind of opened Pandora's box with regards to AI? And secondly, are there any means by which the government can potentially monitor and anticipate these individual threats while also respecting limits on government oversight and individual liberties?
Yeah, Nick, wow, that's a biggie too. Like I said, if we went way back in time to last November, we did think that this would be the drivers and the winners. You might have competition would be who's got the most data, who's got the most money, and those are by definition large entities. But as you said, and I'm not saying it all at the feet of Meta, but when Meta released Llama, and then suddenly you had an open systems versus closed systems, and we can say, well, maybe they shouldn't have, or did they leak it or not leak it? But that's all moot. The argument that it is out there, and there is a little bit here. So you set rules in this country, and then the Montenegro creates the smartest woman around to do AI tools. I don't know how you fully get it right. That's why I do think some level of, you need a regulatory sense, but you also need some, and this is where the administration's tried, at least some code of ethics. I do think you need, this cannot be solved no matter, even if America had the best rules in the world, it's got to be done in collaboration with the rest of the world. And some of these sanctions will be legal, some of these sanctions will be moral, some of these sanctions will just be, a lot of the old, all of the old spy movies and James Bond movies and all this stuff, the bad guys could use these tools in a way that could have huge effect. Now, again, we're focusing mostly on the evil. It could also unlock cures. It could, make people's lives more productive. But as I think back to your comment, it was, remind me your first name again? Aiden, yeah. Who's got a great public school teacher mom. Figuring this out in a real way, part of this will go back to Aiden's mom and others having some system of education where, education is facts, but it's also some level of values and some basic respect values. I mean, one of the things, I think my job is hard, but my job is simple compared to being a school board member anywhere in America today. When you think about something that scares the hell out of me is, if people opt out of that kind of public service because it's just too hard at this point, that's not a good day for our country.
Okay, let's go over here.
I'm good sitting. My name is Ruta. I am a student here at Georgetown in the college, and I'm also a constituent of Northern Virginia, and I've been here, my whole family has, and I think it would be counterproductive of us if we weren't to talk about this today. So as of this morning, 11,220 Palestinians have been killed, including over 4,000 children. Senator Durbin officially announced today to take the moral lead in supporting a ceasefire. When will you stand up for what is right, represent the majority of your constituents, and follow his lead in supporting a ceasefire?
Well, first of all, Rita, I appreciate you asking the question. And what is happening in the Middle East is horrific. And I'm working right now on a statement around at least the pause, a humanitarian pause. And I know that there's a request for more than that. The tragedy of October 7th was a tragedy, but it was also that, and I support Israel's right to defend itself, but defending itself and following international rules of how war ought to be conducted or treatment of civilians, I think is I'm concerned. I'm concerned about what's happening in West Bank. I'm concerned about the fact that, the blockade for 14 years of the Palestinians in Gaza. And I do think some of this was, I think the diminishment of opportunities for a two-state solution, particularly on some of the West Bank. I'm very worried as well about what has happened with some of the settlers there in terms of taking action against Palestinians. But I also think that, and let me just say this clearly as well, I don't think empathy for the Palestinian people doesn't have to translate to sympathy for Hamas. I think one of the reasons why Hamas launched this was because the people of Gaza, people who had been living in Gaza, were so sick of the draconian rule that they literally wanted the PA to come back. The PA's not got a great reputation in the West Bank. So I'd like us to see this pause in hostilities. I'd like this to see a humanitarian relief come in, but I'd also like to see the release of the hostages. And I think, again, I'll have something more to say about this. Senator Kaine and I are working on something right now, later tonight, and I can assure you, I've met with folks of all faith communities in Virginia already. I had a group in yesterday, and some of the stories were tragic. I mean, there was someone from connected with the Adams Mosque, and who's been active in the community a long time, lost 35 members of his family a couple days ago. And my biggest hope, and is at this bleakest moment, that this, as we get to cessation of hostilities, defaulting back to the status quo, isn't a good answer for the Palestinians, isn't a good answer for Israel, isn't a good answer. And I feel at times the current Israeli government, and this doesn't by any means, I've seen what happened on some of the images of October 7th, and they were brutal. They were horrific beyond beyond belief. And I frankly think, some of that more should be, some of that film should be released. But I do think this drives home entirely the point that the idea that there could be long-term security for people in the Middle East simply if Israel forms agreement with other Arab governments in the region alone doesn't cut it.
Thanks. Let's try to get someone in the back half of that.
Hi, my name is John Dazzy, and I'm from the School of Continuing Studies doing my first year in Masters of Technology Management. So my question is, AI systems on its own is great, right? One system is amazing, but the issue of connecting, having a number of network in AI systems is my main concern. Like, the problem is, how do you control this? You talked about forming policies in the country, and we are struggling to have who has more data, who's more powerful. So if you're creating these policies and are not being followed by all these communities, like we have certain countries all fighting for power. So are you reducing your capability to protect yourself and also like defend yourself if it has to come like in attacking ways, whilst these other countries are actually like not considering politics, not considering rules, and they're creating all these systems for a malicious intent. So how are you going to consider this?
Right. Well, I think
the
you're asking a little
reference
bit-
here is we students here, when ChatGPT came out, like, I'm not going to use this. Like, well, this is amazing. And your friend starts using it, it's like doing really great. Like, even if your values are like, I'm going to use my brains to do it. But like, then you are, maybe not. He's getting an A, I'm getting like a C. Heck no, I'm just going to do it as well. So how is this playing around in terms of using AI and creating policies for a group of people and those who aren't following it?
Right, or also, to make it worse, it's like, something comes out with a tool that may not be as transparent as ChatGPT, and instead you suddenly read, oh my gosh, that 1,000 voices that say this is the greatest thing around, and all those are fake generated voices. And then you get sucked into something where you might be giving up your information or a whole series of other things that, because you got no guardrail. And the challenge is we already see and potentially manipulation of images taking place in conflicts around the world. I don't know how, I don't think you can't build a castle and say, okay, we want to try to protect all Americans or all people who live here and build a moat around that. So that's again why, unless we engage with the whole world on this and have some set of international standards, I think we're going to be prey to this activity in a way that could be hugely damaging. Again, not a very satisfactory answer. I get it. But I come back to the fact that we've, and this is where maybe I've been humbled a little bit by, with all the challenges around social media, the fact that we've done nothing. And this is exponentially more challenging tools because they can happen at, again, back to speed and scale. And questions that were asked by the young lady here about, the content of artistic creation or songs or copyright, all that could be, all up for grabs.
Okay, let's come to this side.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Talia Stringfellow. I'm a first-year public policy student at the McCourt School. And I'm curious about, this is AI, but the tech industry generally, it affects all citizens all over the world, and it's a global issue. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk more about the harmonization of EU regulation with our allies and just even Chinese regulations, and also enforcement mechanisms that you expect once we finally do get to a regulatory point.
Well, that's, that goes back to the question of, even if you have major nation states that we might not fully agree with, for example, I think there's some the fact that the Chinese government was at the summit in the UK, I think that's good. But how you deal with outliers is a problem. Now, you could make the same argument, though, that if you go back to when Russia released, one of the things, let me step back. One of the things I've been surprised at in the Russia-Ukraine fight is that we've not seen more draconian cyber attacks. Well, there and frankly here. And a little bit of this goes back to, like, there was an attack a few years back called the NotPetya attack, where Russia unleashed something that went outside the network. And it came back and bounced back and hit Russia as well. And it created, the fact that we've had these same kind of potential threats around bad actors in cyber, but it hasn't kind of been catastrophic yet, may mean that, the one-off innovator may or may not be able to create this tool that will, kind of go asunder. But I don't know, because it used to be, I thought, again, a long, long time ago, like 8 months ago, when I thought, well, gosh, you got to have so many NVIDIA chips and GPUs that will be able to figure out who the bad actor is, and they'll have to have such a data center and so much compute power that you can't do this rogue. But all that economics is fundamentally changed. And I can tell you, the smartest people in U.S. government don't know the answer to your question. It's similar to the gentleman in the back who said about all these networks around the world. This is real time playing out.
I'm getting the hook.
Other than that, how was the theater, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yeah, do me a favor, come back. We have so many more questions. Come back once you guys solve this whole thing, and tell us how you did it.
Let me just go this, and let me also again say, what's playing out in the Middle East is heartbreaking beyond words and belief. And I also think what's happening, and we've somehow taken our eyes off as well, though. What's happening to the people of Ukraine is pretty heartbreaking as well. The village that was totally murdered when people were at a funeral. And there are so many reasons to be, I make the comment that I totally get the fact that you want to throw a shoe at the TV when the news comes on. I feel the same way, and I'm inside the TV sometimes. But there's also, I know how Americans feel in terms of the president stuff, but we got lower unemployment, almost at historic low. We've had job creation levels coming post-COVID at historic highs. We have still a nation that people desperately want to come to, literally will give up their lives to try to touch what we takes for granted every day. AI, 90% of the innovation is still being driven out of this country. We have seen forces around the world particularly rally against the Russian aggression. I would have not thought the expansion of NATO. We read about, all of us in politics fighting each other, but if you go back to the CHIPS bill or the infrastructure bill, which will actually make broadband fully available and affordable to 98% of Americans in the next 3 years, we don't get that right. It was failure of execution, not of money. We ponied up the money. That was all bipartisan. And I guess my appeal to all of you, and Rita, you as well, is that we just, we can't opt out. We can't check out. You need to press me. If you don't like the answer, press me or run instead or something. But the thing that if you had to say the thing that I worry about the most, and AI could feed into this, and it's a little bit of what's happened in Russia. I've been very much following this guy Navalny, who is the Russian dissident who literally went back knowing he was going to be arrested by Putin and that regime.
I apologize to interrupt, but what good is all our domestic policy if we are aiding and abetting a genocide? What good is it when we're sending, just as of 10 minutes ago, the U.S. Congress just approved a $13 billion bill to send money to Israel that will aid and abet genocide? What good is all of this?
Ma'am, I can say this, that that bill is currently formed, the president said he's not even going to sign it. So, but I would say this, what's happened in Russia is that 65% of the Russian people, and disproportionately young people, don't believe there's anything they can do to change their system. And when you opt out and say nothing can change my life, that is when authoritarians walk in. And I do think we have a role both domestically and internationally to be a leader and also a moral leader. And I do think calling out and providing relief for the humanitarian crisis has to be a priority of this administration. And let me also again say thank you guys for coming on a Thursday afternoon with lots and lots going on.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking our community's questions. Let's do this again.
You got it.
Thank you to the Tech and Public Policy for being part of this. Also, I want to give shout outs to our staff who've been working their tails off, putting together a lot of events this semester. Thank all of you for the cool deep fake video or audio. And I also want to thank your staff. Rachel, where's Rachel?
Right here.
A nice communications director is a Hoya, once again showing your propensity to hire smart Hoyas to do your communications over the years.
Hoyas, then I got colonials. So I guess that's or I guess
Thank
no
you
longer
all.
colonials. They're revolutionaries or whatever they are now.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.